They are putting a man at the centre of America's health department who fundamentally doesn't believe in modern medicine. There's a lot of conspiracy in what he believes. I mean, even if you put to one side the stuff about whether or not he killed a baby bear and left it in Central Park.
He's also suggested that human-made chemicals in water systems could turn children gay or transgender. So it's the chemicals in the water. He's peddled AIDS denialism stories.
There's a lot of kind of batshit crazy stuff. Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, that's on February the 24th. And finally to Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of those dates. The link will be in the description below. We're really excited to see you there.
He lacks any relevant government, financial, management, or medical experience. His views on vaccines are dangerous and willfully misinformed. These facts alone should be disqualifying. But he has personal qualities related to this job, which for me pose even greater concern. I've known Bobby my whole life. We grew up together. It's no surprise that he keeps birds of prey as pets, because Bobby himself is a predator. He's always been charismatic, able to attract others through the strength of his personality, his willingness to take risks and break the rules. I watch his younger brothers and cousins follow him down the path of drug addiction. His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks. It was often a perverse scene of despair and violence.
If there are more damning words, it's hard to imagine what they would be. And the person you heard speaking there is the one surviving child of John F. Kennedy, first cousin to Robert F. Kennedy, who today is facing confirmation hearings to be America's next Health and Human Services Secretary.
Caroline Kennedy hasn't spoken out before because she's been in an ambassadorial role, the US ambassador to Australia. But now she says, on the day that Robert F. Kennedy is going before senators to ask for one of the biggest jobs in American government, she thinks it's time to tell America what he's really like. Welcome to the Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily. And we should say that this afternoon and the rest of this week, we will see the confirmation hearings of three of the biggest, arguably most controversial players in Trump's new administration. Kash Patel, who's going for head of the FBI. He's somebody who was writing children's books about the Wicked Witch Hillary Clinton not so long ago. And he will be joined by Robert F. Kennedy for health. And we'll also see the Senate confirmation hearings of Tulsi Gabbard, who is somebody who's got a lot of people's backs up for her proximity to both Putin and to Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who's going for the job of Director of National Intelligence.
Yes, so some people might say she's not the ideal fit to be the head of national intelligence for the United States, given that background. But the Robert F. Kennedy one is interesting because Robert F. Kennedy is charismatic. He's got a surname Kennedy. You can see the attraction for Donald Trump of having somebody like this. He is a vaccine skeptic to the nth degree and has had to be kind of convinced that he has to say, well, polio vaccines are a good thing. And he is so controversial. And I think the remarkable thing about listening to Caroline Kennedy there is not that she's opposing her first cousin, not that she's talking down his fitness for office, but it's just so jarring with the present mood in America, which is, of broadly speaking, acquiescence, and that Donald Trump can do what he wants, can have what he wants, can appoint who he wants. And that is the mood in America right now. And Caroline Kennedy has put herself right out on a limb by saying what she has said.
Yeah, and I think the way you have to see it is that Caroline Kennedy won't be changing the minds of the diehard Trumpist Republicans. What she's trying to do is remind the Democrats in the room that they have to go along with their gut instincts on this. Robert F. Kennedy has said that hepatitis B vaccine is given to children only because Merck, the pharmaceutical company, colluded with the government to get the shot recommended for kids. There's a lot of conspiracy in what he believes. I mean, even if you put to one side the stuff about whether or not he killed a baby bear and left it in Central Park, or whether or not he, was it ate a shark, killed a shark?
Yeah, decapitated a whale, I thought. I mean, there are all sorts of stories.
There's a lot of kind of batshit crazy stuff, but that's not the stuff that they're going to be concerned about. The stuff they're going to be concerned about is whether they are putting a man at the centre of America's health department who fundamentally doesn't believe in modern medicine. And I think we have seen so far very little resistance within Trump's Republican Party, within the Republican Party, I should say, to any of his confirmation hearings so far. Pete Hegseth got in by the narrowest of margins. He's the Fox News anchor that is now going to be the head of defence. Right. And it was only because two kind of independent-minded Republican senators, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, were joined by Mitch McConnell, the former Senate leader, that it had to go to a tie, which brought in J.D. Vance. If that was the most controversial, and that still got through, I think Caroline Kennedy's thinking, don't screw this one up. This would be bad news for everyone's child, for everyone trying to kind of get by in America.
Look, you mentioned one or two of the things that Kennedy has espoused in the past. I mean, I could add a little bit to that list. He's also suggested that human-made chemicals in water systems could turn children gay or transgender. So it's the chemicals in the water. He's peddled AIDS denialism, alleging that HIV does not cause AIDS and questioning the theology that HIV is the sole cause of AIDS. He's gone on to talk about the vaccines cause autism in child, the MMR vaccine, and so it goes on.
I mean, discredited theories from 20 years ago, he still clings on to, even though they have been roundly rejected by medical consensus.
But on the flip side of that, there have been one or two Democrats as well who have come to his side over kind of America's obesity crisis and the fact that, you know, super processed foods are making Americans obese with type 2 diabetes, and they need to change their diet, and ultra processed foods are not the way to go. Now, Donald Trump, who loves nothing more than a Big Mac, you know, it could be the next health secretary.
Do you know
taking
what?
on
All
food.
I would say, and you're right, I mean, but it is possible to want to do something about an American obesity problem without actually throwing out modern medicine and vaccination at the same time. I mean, I was quite surprised to hear Bernie Sanders, who obviously is an independent, he's the independent senator for Vermont, but he caucuses always with the Democrats. He was saying he's very minded to, you know, listen out RFK and see what he says. I mean, you can see why some on the left who have long campaigned against whether it's big pharma or, you know, big capitalism or the sort of takeover of America by the multinationals, they do want to hear him out. And maybe it will be that even people like Bernie Sanders kind of think that he's going to offer something fresh to the way America views its sort of health system. But it is interesting that on the night before, you're getting somebody who knows him very well saying, don't make this mistake.
I was talking to a friend who works for the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which was in charge of the whole sort of effort during the COVID pandemic. And she was saying she's terrified. I mean, terrified not for her own job, although that's probably going to be vulnerable anyway. And a lot of other kind of scientists are very worried about that. But she said for the nation's health. I mean, if they do go back on MMR or do go back and you suddenly have measles outbreaks galore.
Measles and polio.
And you know, it's just unthinkable that you would turn the clock back on that. And yet RFK Jr. is kind of pressing all those hot button issues which speak to American denialism and speak to conspiracy theory. And he could be the next Health and Human Services Secretary for the United States.
I do think what's happened in our lifetime in the past few years is that conspiracy theory has jumped off the page. There was a long time when conspiracy lived, you know, in the dark web or in the sort of chat rooms or, you know, with people's conversations in the pub. Now the conspiracy theory that Donald Trump, you know, won an election he lost leads people to the Capitol to riot. Now a conspiracy theory that you know, pharmaceutical companies are working in thrall with the government to try and cheat you, even though it's poisoning your children, is actually going to have a real life effect, on whether people are vaccinated or not.
Well, yesterday we had the first briefing at the White House by the new press secretary, Caroline with a K, Levitt, who I think is 27 years old, the youngest person ever to be appointed press secretary at the White House. And oh my word, what a different event it was, because all the people who were called first were people like Breitbart News, where the Breitbart guy says, "You're looking good," which is obviously what you want to tell a press secretary, because it's all about their appearance, and let us not forget. And so it went on in a most bizarre manner. And they're trying, clearly, to reshape who can attend a White House briefing. That is quite remarkable.
Yeah, and one of the things that she was asked about there was this attempt by Trump to block aid, essentially federal funding for domestic and international aid programs. And she explained them all in this clip.
So what does this pause mean? It means no more funding for illegal DEI programs. It means no more funding for the Green New scam that has cost American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. It means no more funding for transgenderism and wokeness across our federal bureaucracy and agencies. No more funding for Green New Deal social engineering policies.
The trouble with this is that there are many problems with this, but it raised more questions than it answered, because she was asked about programs to Medicaid, i.e. free healthcare for the elderly. That includes veterans programs. That includes HIV drug support. Suddenly we're asking whether veterans are too woke to get money, whether, HIV medication is woke. Is that woke? So you're stuck there. I mean, apart from the fact that he can't just end this stuff because it has to go through Congress. I mean, the first article in the Constitution gives Congress the power over how the money is spent, how government money is spent.
It sets budgets.
It sets budgets. And Trump's now tearing that up and going, oh no, we're not going to have all this. It's all woke spending. Oh really? Woke spending to soldiers and woke spending to kids and woke spending to the elderly. Like, is that honestly what people voted for this time around?
Well, I mean, a federal judge has halted that, and that's going to go to appeal, and that will have to work its way through the court system. But Trump is trying to knock every door down, and he's just seeing what resistance he meets on the other side. So just going back to the briefing room briefly, because I think it's fascinating that, when I was there, at the back of the room, there are 7 rows of 7 seats in the White House briefing room.
It's tiny.
Tiny. It's really small. And we had a seat which was our own. But then we were told during the first Trump administration, we were sharing it with One American News Network. So we had it one day, they had it another day. And if it was a kind of a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 in the month, we got it. But if it was a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 in the month, they got it. Now,
dare I say they could just increase the size
of the
James Brady room.
Yeah. What they're saying now is that we want to see Breitbart News, we want to see Axios, we want to see
news agents.
Podcasts. Yeah, the news agents, I don't think was top of her lips, actually, on the edge of her lips. No, I don't think it was. But I think
But it is a recognition that actually news sources are coming from very different places now.
Yeah. And it used to be the case that a briefing wouldn't start until CNN and the Washington Post and the New York Times had arrived in the room, and they would have the front row seats and they would get the first questions. Yeah. That game is over now. Yeah. And maybe good thing too that sort of has changing. And yesterday we had on air the resignation of a TV journalist who was the scourge of the first Trump administration. He always asked the toughest questions at news conferences. Donald Trump tried to ban him from the White House briefing room, but failed because of the First Amendment rights. But CNN, for whatever reason, decided that his slot in the afternoon was going, and that they would give him a middle of the night slot, almost as though CNN was doing the White House's work. And so Jim Acosta on TV yesterday announced that he was off.
Just wanted to end today's show by thanking all of the wonderful people who work behind the scenes at this network. You may have seen some reports about me and the show. And after giving all of this some careful consideration and weighing an alternative time slot CNN offered me, I've decided to move on. I am grateful to CNN for the nearly 18 years I've spent here doing the news. People often ask me if the highlight of my career at CNN was at the White House covering Donald Trump. Actually, no. That moment came here when I covered former President Barack Obama's trip to Cuba in 2016 and had the chance to question the dictator there, Raul Castro, about the island's political prisoners. As the son of a Cuban refugee, I took home this lesson. It is never a good time to bow down to a tyrant. I've always believed it's the job of the press to hold power to account. I've always tried to do that here at CNN, and I plan on doing all of that in the future. One final message. Don't give in to the lies. Don't give in to the fear. Hold on to the truth and to hope. Even if you have to get out your phone, record that message. I will not give in to the lies. I will not give in to the fear. Post it on your social media so people can hear from you too.
It's quite sobering, actually, isn't it? Hearing it from somebody who, by all accounts, had a successful afternoon show. The ratings were good. I mean, the irony is that moving him to the middle of the night might have been when Donald Trump actually watches TV anyway. But I think what you get from that is the story of this time round. The resistance is gone.
Totally.
Right?
Totally, it's gone. And we started the episode with Caroline Kennedy and saying what's remarkable is that there are little tiniest pockets of resistance left, but overwhelmingly the media establishment seems to be setting a new path for Trump 2.0, which is we're going to play nicely this time. We are not going to do what we did. And you heard Acosta there, who, at times was brilliant in his questioning of Donald Trump. I mean, yeah, occasionally a bit performative, occasionally a bit too showy-offy, but he did that job. And Donald Trump will be notching that up as another small victory that Jim Acosta is no more. It
wasn't so long ago that we were all slack-jawed because Jeff Bezos has decided, against his editorial team at the Washington Post, not to back Kamala Harris. And, of course, retrospectively, it seems like absolutely the commercially clever thing to have done. And I think there probably are bosses and editors and, corporations all over America now who are thinking, yeah, let's just make our life a bit easier.
It's a new reality. It really is.
We'll be back in a moment talking to the historian Peter Frankopan, who's in Colombia, shortly to arrive in Panama at the same time as Marco Rubio will tell the Panamanians that Donald Trump wants the canal back. All that to come.
Can you assure the world that as you try to get control of these areas, you are not going to use military or economic coercion?
No.
What is the strategy?
Yeah. I can't assure you. You're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this. We need them for economic security. It might be that you'll have to do something. Look, the Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China.
We can't reassure you that we won't use military force. That was Trump, before he was inaugurated, explaining that he wanted to get control of the Panama Canal. This is not an entirely new idea for US presidents, far from it. But this week, his US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is doing a whistle-stop tour of Latin America, trying to put Trump's point to the Panamanians.
Yeah, so what does he say? He sits down with the Panamanian president and says, hey, it's great to meet you. But unless you do X, Y, and Z, we're going to invade your country. And, George H.W. Bush invaded Panama in 1989. Now, that was a different set of circumstances. It wasn't over the strategic control of the Panama Canal. It was part of the battle against drugs and communism, and they thought that General Manuel Noriega was racketeering and actually running a drugs exporting empire to the United States, and he was eventually kind of captured and sent back to prison in the US. So
but that was not to do with the canal. This time, it is all economic warfare. Yeah. And it's all to do with who controls the Panama Canal, which fundamentally goes back to, you've guessed it, China.
Yes, because the ports at the either end of the canal are run by a Hong Kong-based company. Yeah. And so the fear is that the Hong Kong-based companies could actually be a choke point to the movement of trade through the canal, which is such a vital artery for goods that are moving between the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Well, let's talk now to the Professor of Global History at Oxford, historian Peter Frankopan, who is in Colombia as we speak and is heading to Panama in about an hour. What are we meant to make of all this, Pete?
Well, I mean, it's been an obsession in US foreign policy for more than 100 years. I mean, I don't think because we don't think about Panama too much, we forget that the United States was instrumental in Panama becoming independent. I mean, the attempt to control a strip that could link the Pacific and the Atlantic was the reason why, in the beginning of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt helped send in US Marines and helped support rebels to detach Panama from Colombia. So the control of the canal was hugely important, then became divisive in the middle of the 20th century during the Cold War and the sort of pullback from colonialism. There were riots in the late 1950s, early 1960s in Panama about why it was that another state held control of the Panama Canal zone. And that led to negotiations between the US and Panama in the 70s. But Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president, made a big thing about Panama being part of US sovereign territory, part of the canal not being
Because it was Carter, wasn't it? It was Carter that sort of gave it back.
Well, Carter negotiated. I mean, I think that the writing was on the wall that if you have colonies in other parts of the world, that age of empire seemed to be dead. I mean, whether in fact Trump is going to recreate empires is another story. But Reagan was extremely critical of any idea that Panamanian control of its territory should be handed back. And he said, Panama is not a colony or a US territory. It belongs to the United States in the same way that Alaska does, or the same way that Louisiana does. So it's been bubbling under for a long time. And I suppose if you take the last 100 years as a whole, strongmen presidents in the United States talk about Panama a lot, and Trump is the latest to do that.
But if you go to Panama, feels like it's the most American city outside of America. It's all the kind of strip malls, all the same shops, everything you would see in America. And it is very pro-American. So what is the centre of their concern?
Well, I don't know, but my guess would be that since Trump was elected, he's been given intelligence briefings. And one of the things that those briefings would have been warning him about would be about choke points globally, of which there's a handful of connector points through which global trade can be restricted, and therefore ability to look after your own backyard or to put pressure on your rivals. And something would have caught Trump's eye about Panama, which is that obviously it saves huge amounts of time cutting through from the Pacific to the Atlantic rather than going around the southern coast of South America. And I imagine in the briefing pack there had been something about how the port is operated by a privately owned Hong Kong-based company called Hutchison Port Holdings, which is the world's biggest port holdings. And Trump has put two and two together and said, well, that's obviously a Chinese strategic threat. And I suppose if one's trying to be persuasive about giving Trump the benefit of the doubt, obviously the ability to restrict US cargoes does have a potential pinch point. I mean, there's no sign of that. That hasn't happened before. I can't see it would happen in the future. But I think it's part of a wider reading in of Trump orienting his White House towards Beijing and trying to work out how to, first of all, protect US national interests. And Panama, I suppose it's not entirely surprising that's at the top of the list, but there are lots of different ways of making sure that you're safe in your backyard, but threatening to invade and to recover it and to reconquer the Panama Canal zone probably isn't the most helpful way to build friends.
It is part of a sort of bullying strategy of the Latin American countries. I mean, we saw the week begin with his threat to smack 25 to 50% tariffs on Colombia if they didn't take back they're migrants, right? They're immigrants. They're criminals.
Well, I'm the Gary Lineker in his heyday, turning up at the right place at the right time. So I flew into Bogota on Sunday, and just as this was all kicking off, and I think how it looks to the outside world is, look, Trump is bullying his way towards global South countries, trying to get them to do what they want, what he wants, and to forcibly make them concede to whatever he tells them to do. I think here locally it was seen slightly differently. I mean, President Petro has had a scandal-hit presidency. He's a man of the hard left. The reason why this all kicked off was Petro refused to allow undocumented Colombians to be brought back to Colombia because they were going to be flown in military planes and potentially handcuffed. And he made a big point, I think, about virtue signaling about human rights, which is not entirely wrong. I mean, obviously, we can all understand that, but Trump exploded. To which the president here, Petro, went onto Twitter and gave a very, very long explanation about how oil kills the world and Trump is going to kill everybody and that he would never shake the hand of a white slaver, which I think he means Trump, and then immediately folded when it was pointed out to him that Colombia sends about 25% of its exports to the United States. So here domestically, it looks like a president who tried to make a big stand against the US, who was firmly put in his place. And I think that although it's right that Trump uses force, that way of doing things alienates people. And I think that the example of Colombia is more important to see what it is that other people in other parts of the world see as US foreign policy. So in fact, this morning, I've woken up reading the press across the Middle East, and their papers in Saudi and UAE talking about the anxiety about the way that Trump is talking about the Gaza Strip as a real estate opportunity, and that Palestinians should be pushed back out to live in Egypt and Jordan. And I think that that's part of a theme that we're going to see in Trump's presidency, of a muscular forcing of an American vision. And not surprisingly, not everybody's comfortable being told what to do by a new arrival in the White House. So it's not just about Colombia, not just about Latin America, although Rubio's doing a tour in Central America now to try to make friends, but he's going to start off on the back foot because lots of people's backs have been put up.
So does Rubio double down? I mean, he's there representing Donald Trump. If you want to ensure that you've got a short life as Secretary of State, the one thing would be to say, well, don't take Donald too seriously.
Well, the logic would be good cop, bad cop, and that Rubio would smooth feathers and would say the right kinds of things and talk about friendships and so on. And I suspect he might do that. But I think the wild card on the bingo card is, might Trump actually use force against Panama? We all assume that what he says and what he does are two different things. But I think it's not completely out of the question that we'll see in America that uses its expansive force in different ways. And again, that's an important theme of the 19th and 20th century, the ideas around what American values are and how they can and should be exported around the world. And I think there's something in that about being careful that we don't just always assume that Trump is a showman, rather than actually meaning something a bit more serious.
Peter, the other thing that Donald Trump is frequently badged with is being isolationist, America first, pull up the drawbridge. And yet here we see an expansive, muscular, kind of, unafraid to go into other countries where you would think that America has no interests.
Well, I think they do have interests. I mean, something like Greenland, for example. Greenland is obviously, in a warming world, strategically sensitive. I mean, it was extremely strategically sensitive before the world started to warm so dramatically as it has done in the last 30 years. The raw materials and raw natural resources all sitting and presumably to be exploited. And there are, I suppose, only three options of how they're going to get exploited. One is by China or China-related state-owned companies or those close to Beijing. One is by Wall Street, and one is by the US government. And it's not beyond the realms of logic that a better relationship between Greenland and the US is a good thing. The Greenlanders feel very bruised how they've been treated by Denmark for decades, the lack of investment that have suddenly started to accelerate. So I think it's just important to not always play the man and to sometimes play the ball. So you're right, John. I mean, obviously the US talking about isolationism, but actually you can see interventions in all sorts of different parts of the world. They don't just have to be done through the deployment of American troops and forces. It's about trying to build a world which is conducive towards American interests. And I don't think that that's a separate story to Trump saying he wants to be isolationist. He doesn't seem to lack ideas of how to do that. And it's a real question mark for all of us here in all over the world, here in Latin America, but also in the UK, to work out, do we just be quiet? Do we play along? Or could we, as we know from the news agents, even give a straight answer to sort of pretty simple questions about what we will do if Trump uses force or threatens or moves in ways that are potentially break international law? And I think that our willingness not to annoy Trump is mirrored around the world. I've been in Southeast Asia earlier this year, and everybody I spoke to there, their view is the best thing to do with Trump in the White House is to stay quiet and hope not to pop onto his radar.
Peter Frankopan, thank you so much. Thank you.
Tucker Carlson is rip-roaring mad that people think his son Buckley got a job just because he's Tucker Carlson's son. My question, who the hell names their son Buckley Carlson? All right? That sounds like a clinic that treats chronic yeast infections. The Buckley Carlson chronic yeast infections.
So we end with the news that Tucker Carlson's son, Buckley, is joining J.D. Vance's staff, J.D. Vance being the vice president. You heard it there from Charlemagne the God, who is the one podcaster that actually did talk to Kamala Harris, the one that didn't actually swing the election for her. But he is there pointing out the Nepo perfection of Trump's second administration carrying on.
Yeah, it's really good to see they're draining the swamp and just putting their own relatives into all the key positions. So,
got rid of DI, got rid of equity, diversity,
inclusion.
And merit.
Yeah, and just go for Nepo babes. It's the new Trump America.
Well, it's not really. It's the old Trump America as well, where he actually had his own babes in the positions inside the White House.
Oh, yes, so he did.
Yeah, he's
yeah,
done
they
that
all
already.
had key positions, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
We'll be back next week.
See you then.
Bye.
The Newsagents USA.